In this video, you're gonna
I want to say it.
Okay.
In this video, you are going to learn how to make Venom Tendrils in the free version of Davinci Resolve.
Here I am inside of Fusion. So first we're gonna make the Venom symbiote texture. And that's what's really gonna do most of the work of making this look good. I'm going to add a blend. So to start, I'm gonna bring down the color to almost black. Not all the way, but almost, just so that a little bit of our lighting will show up better. So if I middle mouse click, I can move around the light. So this would be a poor man's Venom texture. You could slap this on and call it a day, but let's add some details to it to really enhance it. Bring down a fast noise, just bring up the detail. Then I'm going to add a create bump map and a bump map. So in the create bump map, just gonna bring up the height scale all the way. Then the bump map, change the source image type to bump map. Adds this nice texture. So if we plug this into the blend, take a look at that, really adds a lot of detail to it. One thing you can do in the fast noise is just little tiny bit bring up the seed rate. Now it's kind of bubbling, rippling, making it look alive. But we're not quite done yet. Let's add a reflect. Now if we bring this to the viewer, nothing happened. That's because we need an image input. So I'm gonna bring down the 360-degree image I took of my room. It's not perfect, and it really doesn't need to be. This is just to add some details to the reflection. So I'm gonna add a sphere map, then plug this into this triangle right here, the reflection color material, bring that to the viewer. Now we can play around with the face-on strength, the glancing strength, and the fall off. But you notice it still doesn't look quite right. What we can do is bring the bump map into this. Now it's being displaced like the rest of it, and it looks much more realistic. Now that we have this texture, we can add it to any 3D shape and it'll look like it's a symbiote. So now let's work on making the tendril. I'm gonna set the shape to a sphere. Now this looks nothing like a tendril. So what we can do is under the translation tab, under the scale, uncheck lock X, Y, and Z. Then we can just bring the X and the Z all the way down. So now it's super thin, we can't even see it. One thing to do to put it on this grid, take the Y and put it to 1. And then under the pivot, change the Y to -1. So the pivot determines where it'll scale from. So if I bring down the Y, you can see it's scaling from this point here. So now let's give it some thickness. I'm gonna add a displace 3D, bring that to the viewer, nothing happened. This also needs an input, so I'm gonna bring down a fast noise and plug that in. Well, now it has thickness, but this looks absolutely horrendous. So we can fix that. First of all, right here, we can see there's this big gaping hole. So what I can do is add a weld 3D. That fixes that problem, but it still looks weird and blocky. So what we can do is bring the base subdivisions and the height subdivisions all the way up. That makes it much smoother. This is obviously too thick. So I'm gonna bring down the scale to 0.03. Let's open the dual viewer and bring the fast noise there. I don't need the media pool. We can bring up some details. Now you see that it has this weird elongated streaking effect. This is because it's being stretched out over this whole sphere. So what I can do is uncheck lock X and Y, bring down the X scale somewhere around 0.7, and bring up the Y scale all the way. Now it's starting to look a little better. We can bring up the contrast a little bit. That makes it a bit boldier. And if we want, we can bring up the seed rate just a little bit. Now this is looking more like a tendril arm, but it's a little skinny. So one thing we can do to thicken it up and add some complexity is copy this displace and paste it down here and here. Then we can bring the weld 3D into both of those. So if I bring this to the viewer, it's exactly the same as the last one. But under the fast noise, I can change the seed a little bit and do the same on the other one. Now I can merge these over each other. Now it still hasn't made it any thicker, they're just merging on top of each other. So what we can do is add a transform 3D on both of them. So I'm gonna right click here on perspective, change it to top. That'll make it much easier for this next step. So what I'm gonna do is with the transform 3D selected, just move this one over a little bit. And then with the other one, move it over here so it looks kind of like a triangle. So now if we go back to perspective, we have these 3 tendrils next to each other. So let's add a bender 3D. Bring this to the viewer. I'm going to change the bender type to twist. Now you see if I turn that, you can see them twisting on the ends. I'm just going to bring down to the center so that they twist from one end. Now each one individually is twisting, but we want to tap into the whole thing. So I'm just going to check group objects. Now if I bring up the slider, the whole thing wraps around itself. Just gonna bring the value to about 2. So now we have it looks like these layers of tendril just wrapping around itself. So next, let's add another bender 3D. Keep this one on bend, group objects, bring the center down just like the last one. Now this one we can use to animate the bend of it. Change the angle a little bit. we can animate it to bend out so it looks like it's wrapping around a person. Now you can tell it's bending the wrong way, and if we change the angle, it's still not curving up. So one thing we can do is add a transform 3D, then just twist the X rotation, maybe play around with the Y rotation until we get it wrapping around. We can also play around with the angle in the Bender 3D. So the nice thing about how the Bender 3D works is since we added a little bit of seethe to our displaces, it's slowly moving and undulating and making it look much more like it's alive. So at any point in this, we can add our texture into it. We can really see how it's starting to come together. I keep the texture out of it so that it runs faster, especially when you're animating it, but if you ever need to take a look at it, see how it looks with the texture. One thing you could actually consider doing is if it's looking still a bit skinny, under the shape 3D, maybe bring up the X and Z scale a little bit. You have to be very, very gentle with it. Yeah, it's looking a little bit better. I'm gonna bring up my texture because now we get to the fun part of animating it. So I'm just gonna go to about 24 frames in, set a keyframe on the Y scale, the twist, and the bend. And I'm just gonna go to the beginning, set this to default, same here, and bring this down all the way. So if we play that, we have it growing and wrapping around itself. But we can see right here, it just comes to a complete stop. So what I'm gonna do is click on all the ones that have animations. So shape 3D, control click on the benders, then under the spline tab, bring this up a little higher, and just check all of these. Then check this right here. So these are all the keyframes. So what I can do is select them all, then hit S. That'll make the keyframes much smoother and more organic looking. Now you can go through the whole shot, animating all these different things to get animation that looks good. And then again, once you're done, go into the spline, just smooth them out. I'm going to add a merge 3D. Now let's add some lighting. You want to do this to match your scene as closely as possible. So I'm going to add a point light, drag that over here because I put it there for some reason, and set it up to match where I had my lights in my real world scene. Now I had a light over here and it was blue. Set that up there, copy that, paste it again. Do this as many times as you need to match the real lights you had in the scene. Next, let's add a camera, bring the merge to both views. Then in this one, I can right click and choose camera. So that'll help me position the camera because whatever I see in this window is what the camera sees. Now we're ready to render. I'm going to add a render 3D, bring this to the viewer, change it to OpenGL render, and enable lighting. Under the output channels, I'm going to check Z and vector. Then the image tab, change the depth to float 16. So next I'm going to add some ambient occlusion, drag the camera into that, change the type to sphere. Now I can just bring down the kernel radius until I start seeing that ambient occlusion, and then change the output mode to color. Next I'm going to add some vector motion blur. Automatically that adds a really nice looking motion blur. Now if you want to put this over footage, first you want to make sure to track where it's going to be. I'm just going to track this area of my shirt here. It's got some nice contrast. Change the adaptive mode to best match. Bring that down a little bit. And then track that forward and backwards. All right, that tracked pretty well for me. What we can do is merge over our arm and add a transform. What we can do is right click on the center, connect to tracker 1, on path position. Now before that, we can add another transform and just play around with the position. But now obviously the tendril's on top of our footage and we want it to look like it's behind me. So I made sure to shoot this with a lot of contrast between the background and my shirt so that I can make a duplicate of my footage, then add a luma keyer, crunch the low and high points, and then we can just merge this over the arm. Now that did the exact opposite of what we wanted, so we can just hit invert. Now if the line is a bit harsh, we can just blur it a little bit, and then maybe contract it a little bit. Now let's blend it a little more. You can see it looks a lot darker than my actual footage, so what I'll do is I'll add a brightness contrast, hover my mouse over the darkest part of my image, looks to be about there, and I'm getting values around 0.05, 0.06. So I'm going to pre-divide post-multiply, then change the lift to 0.05. Then I'm going to go to the brightest part of my image, which is about here, 0.05. Now it's matching the brightness of our footage, but since this is a CG render, it came out super sharp. So I'm going to add a blur. You want to keep this subtle, somewhere around maybe 0.5. And then to match my footage, I'm going to add a sharpen. This is too intense, so maybe 0.3. Yeah, that looks better. At this step in the process, there really aren't exact values. You really just want to play around until it matches your footage. Finally, let's add a little bit of grain. I'm gonna try to get this to match true footage as best as possible, so I'm just gonna bring down the power a little bit and play with the grain softness. And looking at with the footage, I think I may need to play around with my lights a little bit more. One thing I can do to make that go faster is bring my footage into the camera 3D, then to the image tab, lighting, click off affected by lights. Now for this one, it may actually be better to use a spotlight. And then once I'm done with that, I can just bring the image out of the camera. Yeah, it matches a lot more. I know some of you are going to be a little bit disappointed that this is just the tendrils and not a full Venom effect. So if this video reaches 200 likes, then I will make a full tutorial on how to add a CG Venom to your scenes. A lot of the techniques in this video can be repurposed to make a Doc Ock tentacle effect, which I have a tutorial for right here.